Resilience. It is a word that most of us have heard and that is increasingly being used by scholars, policymakers, service providers, the media, and the general public. But what exactly does resilience mean? Who does it apply to, and under what circumstances and conditions? The word resilience dates back to the early 17th century and is derived from the Latin word resilience, which means to rebound, to bounce back, and to return to original form. In modern language, the word resilience has long been used by scholars and in scholarly research, but the meaning of the term is more nuanced. It has evolved over time, and it has a variety of different meanings across the different disciplines. The word resilience has long been used in the natural sciences. And in physics, for example, it has been used to explain the ability of a material, so metal, for example, to withstand pressure that is applied to it and to spring back to its original shape. In biology, it is used to explain the ability of species to live and to thrive in an environment despite changes or attacks from predators. In ecology, it is used to explain the ability of an ecosystem to maintain its function or to return to its original state after a disturbance. Recently, particularly in the last 30 years or so, the term has begun to be used in the social sciences. So in psychology, for example, it's used to refer to individual characteristics that enable individuals to overcome difficulties that they may face in their life. So some of these individual characteristics that psychologists have defined include, for example, intelligence, or problem-solving skills, or self-control and regulation. More recently, in sociology, there has been a movement away from this definition that focuses on individual characteristics, and rather the focus has been on the individual's wider social context and the way in which a variety of different components of someone's wider social context influences their ability to face challenges that they may face in their everyday life. So for example, their family or their schools or their peers and their communities and how they all work together to influence individuals. So in the social sciences, the word resilience is most commonly defined and understood as the ability of individuals to adapt, to overcome, and to recover from serious adversity. But what exactly is adversity? And what is serious adversity? So we all face challenges in our lives, but some have the potential to lead to severe adverse outcomes, particularly when experienced during childhood. And these are referred to as traumatic events. We know from the research that there are a variety of different types of traumatic events that an individual can experience. These include, for example, neglect or abandonment, death of a parent or a caregiver, witnessing or experiencing abuse, the addiction of an important parent or caregiver, and experiencing an environmental disaster. On June 20th, 2013, Alberta experienced a catastrophic flood. At the time, it was the most significant, damaging, and costliest disaster in Canadian history, only recently surpassed by last year's 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire. I remember this day working from my home office and watching outside the window as the rain continued to pour down harder and harder as the day went on. I live in the foothills MD, just between the town of High River and Okotoks. And as the day went on, I became increasingly concerned. So I decided by mid-afternoon that I would drive into the town of Okotoks to pick up my 3 young children who were at school. As I drove there, along a road that bordered the Sheep River in the town of Okotoks, I remember the waters were starting to rise, and the water at that time was reaching the midpoint of the wheel on my large SUV. After I'd picked up my children and safely placed them into my vehicle and drove home, the water at that point was reaching well over the wheel on my vehicle, and it was coming up to the doors on my vehicle. And in fact, the road that I had taken to get there to pick up my children was now closed. I was the last vehicle that they had left pass through that area. That spring, my spouse and I had spent the last several months coaching our son's minor soccer team in High River. And that weekend was supposed to be our final wrap-up event. And we, as the coaches, had put together a big celebratory event where we were going to have a lunch for the team players and their families, and we were going to be handing out medals and certificates to celebrate the wonderful performance of these children over the last several months. They had been undefeated. But that never happened. The town of High River was completely flooded and evacuated, all 13,000 residents. While my own home did not flood, my neighboring communities were devastated. The loss that many of these families experienced was indescribable. It was heartbreaking. Many of these families had lost everything they had ever worked for in their lives and everything that they relied on and needed for their day-to-day survival. They had lost homes, vehicles, personal belongings, many of which had sentimental value and could not be replaced. All of these things damaged or completely destroyed in an instant by the flood waters. I never imagined that I would end up doing disaster research. In fact, from the beginning of my academic career up until that point, I had spent all of my time researching another type of disaster. As a sociologist who studies families, I had mostly looked at families within the context of domestic violence and the experiences of parents and children who had lived in very violent situations. And so I remember 3 months after the flood took place that there were many service providers in High River who kept coming to me and saying, "You're a sociologist, you study families, how can we help the families in our community? They are struggling and we want to help them, but we don't know how. This is unlike anything we had ever experienced." And so at the time, I decided that I would offer several free workshops to families and to community members to help them understand how they could overcome challenges in their lives. And over the next few weeks, I scoured the literature, trying to find answers, trying to find information and ways of how we could help these families. And it quickly became apparent to me that there was not a whole lot of research in this area, that we did not know what to do in times of disasters and how we could help families and parents and children and their wider community, particularly in a Canadian context. And so I went back to these service providers and I said to them, "Do you know how we can help these families? We can help them by asking them how they can be helped. We need to reach out to them. We need to ask them, what are your struggles? What are your needs? What do you need help with?" And so I approached my colleague in my department, Dr. Timothy Haney from Mount Royal University, and I said to him, "You do the sociology of disaster, and I do the sociology of family. Do you want to collaborate and launch a study with all of these service providers in the communities who they want answers to their questions?" And he said, "Yes, absolutely." And so we launched a study, and based on the research, we know that in disasters, some are more vulnerable than others, and that vulnerability is often viewed as a risk factor for trauma, and that trauma is viewed as an obstacle to resilience. We also know from the disaster research that children are among the most vulnerable due to their dependence on adults and due to their physical, cognitive, emotional, and developmental life stages. But we didn't know much more than that. And so as I mentioned, we launched this first study, and we wanted to know, how do families manage, function, and recover from a disaster? And so we decided to interview a total of 105 parents with children 0 to 18 years of age in the town of High River, Alberta, 1 year after experiencing the flood. And the research that I do is largely qualitative research. And our interviews involved face-to-face interviews with parents that lasted anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, where they would come in and we would ask them questions. And what we found is that while some families recovered quite well, other families did not. And in fact, we found that families fell into 2 groups: high coping or low coping ability families. And surprisingly, we found that children coped better than parents had anticipated. And this was very surprising for a lot of these parents. And so what did we find from these 2 types of families? Well, we found that in high coping ability families, that they approached recovery as a collective effort, where they involved all family members. Whereas in low coping ability families, they approached recovery as an individual effort, dealing with the needs of each family member separately in their own silos. We also found that in high coping ability families, that attention was given to the emotional needs of the family members post-flood, whereas in low coping ability families, emphasis was mostly on the physical rebuilding of their homes and of the infrastructure. And then we found that in high coping ability families, that children just recovered better, whereas in low coping ability families, that children struggled with recovery. But we didn't know why. We just knew that children who were in these families that coped really well did really well, but we didn't know more beyond that. And so in a second, more in-depth study that I'm currently conducting with my collaborators, Dr. Julie Drolet from the University of Calgary and Dr. Robin Cox from Royal Roads University, we wanted to know what determines why some children, after experiencing a disaster, are more resilient than others, and what factors, both internal and external, contribute to and promote resiliency among children. And so at this time, we have currently interviewed 79 children, ages 5 to 18 years, and their 79 parents, for a total of 158 participants across southern Alberta, 3 years after experiencing the flood. And we decided we were going to speak to these children themselves and put their voices at the center of our research and find out what their experiences were. And so we found, surprisingly, that more than half of the children, 60%, scored higher than average on the resilience measures that we administered to them. And this was really surprising because this was on a large scale. This is not just a few isolated children who scored higher than average on these resilience scales. And we're talking about a group of children who just experienced a major trauma in their lives. Now, this does not mean that they did not struggle in the short term, not at all. Many of the children spoke about the disruption to their lives, to their routines, and how difficult it was. But what was key is that these children found ways of coping in the long term, and they worked through it. They didn't just stay there. And so what we found is that children with high resilience scores had 4 main things in common. First of all, we found that they had a positive outlook, that they viewed the flood as a learning opportunity and not as an obstacle or as a setback. For example, many of these children told us about how experiencing a disaster was unlike anything they had ever experienced before, and that it was really difficult for them to lose every belonging that they had ever known in their lives, and that was really hard for them, and they struggled with that. But they also spoke to us and told us about how at the same time, this allowed them to really reconsider what mattered in their life and what they really valued. And so many of them spoke about, although it was difficult to lose their favorite teddies, their favorite bike, or their favorite Xbox or iPhone, that they were so grateful that their families were safe. Second, we found that these children thought critically. They were reflective. They asked questions. They came up with solutions after the flood, and they refused to be at the mercy of outside forces. For many of these children after the flood, they had questions. They wanted to know why. So they spoke to us about how they would go to adults in their lives and they would say things like, why did the flood happen? What caused the flood? Will another flood happen again? What can we do in our life to prevent the possibility of another disaster occurring? And they told us that many adults said to them, well, we don't know why. We don't know what caused the flood. And, these things just happen. We don't have any control over this. And there's not anything that you can do. But these children wanted to know the answers to their questions. So they spoke about how they went and they Googled it. And they went and did research for themselves. And many of these children made a connection between the way in which we treat our environment, climate change, and disasters. And for many of these children, they decided to make real life changes. And they said that they wanted to treat the environment different. Even if they didn't know if there was a direct cause to them based on the research that they had done, they wanted to make real change. And so many of them spoke about how they went to their parents and they said to their parents, let's ride our bikes instead of driving. Let's plant a garden. Or let's try to pick up some of the garbage or litter that we see on the walks that we take in our neighborhood. So these were resourceful children. Third, many of these children confided in the close connections in their lives. They reached out to valuable people and shared their feelings about the floods. So for example, many of these children spoke about how they did not know how to respond in the initial aftermath of the flood. And that this scared them because they had never talked about it at school. They had never talked about it at home. They had never heard it talked about on television programs. And so this was new for them. And so what they ended up doing is instead of bottling it up inside themselves, they went and they talked to important people in their lives. They shared how they felt and they received support. And they in turn provided support to others in their lives. And fourth, these children helped and supported others. They actively and directly got involved in flood recovery efforts. For example, many of these children talked about how, and they went around asking, how can we help? Can we help out? And they were told by many adults in their lives, don't worry about it. This is a problem that adults have to deal with. You go and play and do what kids do. We'll take care of it. But many of these children would not take no for an answer. And they tried to find ways in which they could help others in their own lives, whether that meant going to their neighbors and helping clean out their neighbor's home, or even in their own home, taking stock of what was lost and needed replacing, or even comforting and supporting their younger siblings. And what we found from this research is that resilience in children is not an innate characteristic that children are born with. Rather, it is a skill set that children develop, and this is a learning process. We also found that resilience is a skill set that children don't learn to develop on their own. Rather, it is something that is taught, modeled, and reinforced by the important adult allies in their lives. Finally, we found that resilience in children is not an individual effort. Rather, it is a collective effort. This shows that despite their perceived vulnerability, in many ways, children are resilient when faced with the trauma of disasters. In fact, children can and do act as powerful catalysts for change in their own lives, their families, and their communities in the post-disaster context. But children need to be empowered. They need honesty. They need to be supported. And they need to be given the opportunity to be involved in disaster recovery efforts to strengthen their resilience skills in the short term, but also in the long term, helping them to face any adversity that they may face in their future. Finally, and if there's one thing I hope that you take from this talk, it is this. Resilience is not just a way of being, but first and foremost, it is a way of thinking. Resilience is about having perspective, changing the way we think about things, adopting and holding a new and more positive mindset when faced with adversity in our lives. Resilience is the ability to understand and to honestly believe that we are not defined by what happens to us, that there are many circumstances beyond our control, that we are not alone, even though sometimes we may feel that way, but that there are people that surround us who can support us and that we can, in turn, support. And that finally, we can try again. That we can emerge stronger, healthier, and happier if we but choose to have this more positive mindset. The children in my studies demonstrated a tremendous ability to overcome the trauma of the disaster that they experienced. But they learned to do so much more than this. They learned to pick themselves up. They learned to help support others, even in small ways that they could within their own capacity. And they learned to have hope, to not give up, and to keep going. That is what resilience is.